Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about things being in development hell. Generally speaking, when people refer to something being in development hell, they're talking about a piece of media, whether it's a movie, a TV show, a video game, being in development for an obscenely long time, or it being passed around to various producers and development and whatnot, because of there being a lot of behind-the-scenes drama and stuff like that. A great and very often cited example of this is the game Duke Nukem Forever, in development for 14 years, and when it finally came out, it sucked. Another example, one that I am actually currently playing, is Dead Island 2, which was proposed back in 2012 and eventually came out in 2023, 11 years, after being passed around by several different developers. Generally speaking, or at least the way that I remember most media that suffers from being in development hell, the end result is more often than not disappointing, likely due to the property changing hands and influences so many times that it leaves it very muddled, a shadow of its potential. But there are definitely exceptions, and they come out of development hell as a solid piece of media. Dead Island 2, for example, I've actually been very pleasantly surprised by, and I've had a very fun time playing it. Everything about it's just much better than the original Dead Island, which honestly isn't saying very much since the original Dead Island games were very clunky, but I digress. Now, if we transfer this concept over to the world of aviation, planes that get stuck in development hell generally suffer from significant or numerous design flaws that designers struggle severely to work out, examples of which can be found in planes like the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, the Hughes XF-11, the F-4U Corsair to some extent, and those are just American planes from World War II. In most cases, though, the planes that get caught in development hell don't change developers or producers. The designs generally don't change company hands. But our subject for today did just that. This is a carrier-based fighter turned schnellbomber turned high-altitude interceptor. This is the Blohm Voss BV 155. Back before the start of World War II, around the mid-1930s, with Germany revamping every element of its military for the war that they planned on starting, and with an initial agreement with the British in 1935 that allowed for the expansion of the German Navy, Germany set out to build its first aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, the lead ship for their planned Graf Zeppelin class of carriers. Now, the saga of the Graf Zeppelin could be its own video in its entirety, but due to Germany's lack of experience with aircraft carrier design, some political infighting, and just general attention shifts, we'll say, construction of the Graf Zeppelin was a major headache and an overall waste of time and resources. But back in the mid to late 1930s, when the prospects for this carrier class were a lot brighter, the Navy needed viable aircraft for this carrier, and the initial plan was to outfit them with some number of dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo bombers. For the dive bomber role, the planned aircraft was a variant of the Ju-87 Stuka. For the torpedo bomber, it would be the Feisler Fi-167, and for the fighter, it would be a variant of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 in the Bf-109T. This very short-lived variant was effectively just a Bf-109 with bigger wings and control surfaces to help increase the lift and control at lower speeds. Even though they were designed to be carrier-based fighters, they weren't actually equipped with folding wings that you typically see on them. Instead, like on the normal Bf-109s, the wings were removable, detaching at the fuselage. This was effectively just a worse way of doing folding wings, but I guess you can cut Germany some slack here. They weren't terribly familiar with carriers and carrier-based aircraft. while these Bf-109 variants were to be the principal fighter of Germany's new, modern outfit of carriers, only a handful of the 109T were ever made, as work on the Graf Zeppelin was halted around mid-1940 due to the Navy's attention being more focused on U-boats at the time, and various other areas of the German military needed more attention and resources. At the time of the project being halted, the Graf Zeppelin was mostly complete, around 85% or so, and for about 2 years, it would be used just as a glorified massive wood carrier. But by early to mid-1942, aircraft carriers globally had more than shown their value in combat, most notably, famously, and prominently over in the Pacific War, with Germany's ally Japan putting American and British forces in a significant bind. This proven effectiveness was enough for the German Navy to convince Hitler to revive the Graf Zeppelin project, ideally to be finished in roughly a year. However, in that 2-year span that the project sat dormant, the planned principal fighter in the 109T had become outdated, and so a new fighter was to be designed to become that principal fighter. However, because Germany liked to use as few unique designs as they could get away with, in an effort to streamline production, the new design would be relatively little more than just another slightly more modified Bf-109. In what was given the designation of Me-155, Messerschmitt took the fuselage and tail surfaces of the Bf-109G and combined them with a new, larger wing that had a span of 11.05 meters and a wing area of 19.4 meters. Unlike the earlier 109T, the Me-155's wings were actually designed to fold for carrier storage. To be armed with 5 total guns, 1 centrally mounted 20mm cannon, 2 20mm cannons in the wings, and 2 13mm machine guns also in the wings, the 155 was pretty well armed, compared to the Bf-109 anyway, and powered by the Daimler-Benz DB605 with just under 1,500 horsepower. Messerschmitt estimated a top speed of 403 miles an hour, which was roughly about 20 miles an hour less than the Bf-109G, likely a result of the increased wingspan, increasing weight and drag, and also the added gear that was necessary for carrier-based duty, also increasing weight and drag. But still, compared to something like America's F-6F Hellcat, the Me-155 was overall smaller and promised a greater top speed, and it had probably just a slightly worse armament. But overall, the Me-155 promised to be a pretty solid addition to Germany's arsenal. However, as you may have guessed by the fact that there only appears to be 1, maybe 2 drawings of the Me-155, it never advanced past the drawing board and concept phase. This wasn't due to any fault in its design, though, but rather due to another shift in the Graf Zeppelin project. Less than a year into the revitalized carrier project, Hitler, ever the grumpy little guy, soured on the project and on basically any naval project that wasn't U-boats, and by late 1942, early 1943, the project was once again halted, this time for good, and the mostly completed carrier sat unused for the remainder of the war before eventually being scuttled in 1945 before the Soviet army arrived. But back in late 1942, though, with Messerschmitt left once again without a carrier for their design to call home, they would attempt to salvage the 155 design. Even though it hadn't gone anywhere yet, they seemingly had confidence that it could be something pretty valuable. So instead of it being a fighter, they instead went back to an old favorite of the Luftwaffe in the schnellbomber concept. Stripped of its gun armament, The now named Me-155A would be modified to carry a single SC-1000 2,200-pound bomb. This proposal as well, though, went absolutely nowhere, but the basis of this design would be used again in another new design proposal, in a call from the Reich Air Ministry in late 1942 for a new high-altitude interceptor. Around this time, with Germany becoming aware of America's B-29 Superfortress and having an idea, a kind of warped idea, of what it was capable of doing, they wanted an all-new interceptor that had a service ceiling that was well above what they currently had. And Messerschmitt once again would modify the Me-155 into the Me-155B. Due to the much different needs of its new role, the 155B would actually see some more substantial changes, with the plane to be flying at high altitudes, a pressurized cockpit, a stronger engine, and a greater wingspan would all be added at the outset. Out would go the DB605 engine, and in would go the DB628, which was effectively just an alternate DB605 with a two-stage supercharger for greater performance at altitude, and for greater aerodynamic performance and control at high altitude, the wingspan would go from 11.05 meters up to 13 meters. With the more powerful engine, the 155B's service ceiling was estimated to be a whopping 46,250 feet, a roughly 7,000-foot boost over the BF-109G. As the DB628 engine was still pretty unproven, though, it would first be tested on a BF-109G alongside other similar engines, and while it did indeed boost high-altitude performance, up to at least 49,210 feet, and it had solid power output at that height, it was determined that the more powerful DB603 engine would offer a greater boost in performance. However, the DB603 was also much larger than the DB628, which then necessitated an extension of the fuselage. But with the DB603 selected, the final version of the 155B, designated the 155B1, took shape, and it was a rather odd-looking mishmash of parts from already in-production aircraft and other projects. From the BF-109G, it took the fuselage, the wings, the horizontal tail surfaces, and the landing gear, and from the ME-209, it took the vertical tail surface. The BF-109G's wings, though, weren't actually connected to the fuselage, at least not directly, but rather to a new inner wing section. With this new inner wing, it was likely at this stage that the wingspan increased again, from 13 meters up to a mind-boggling 20.5 meters, more than double the width of the baseline 109G. Under wing and under fuselage, for no shortage of engine cooling, at least 4 separate rectangular air intakes would be fit, along with another air intake behind the cockpit for cooling of the DB603's turbo supercharger. Design work on the 155B1 would continue for Messerschmitt up until August 1943. At that point, due to the Air Ministry believing that Messerschmitt as a company was too occupied with other projects to properly develop the 155B1, it was decided that Blohm Voss was to at least partner with Messerschmitt and be the one that produced their design. Basically, Messerschmitt would control what the design looked like, and Blohm Voss were to be the ones that actually built it. However, bizarre aircraft design aficionado Richard Vogt of Blohm Voss, once he and his team got their hands on the 155B1 design, this working relationship that was planned started seeing cracks. The design philosophies of Vogt and the original Me-155 designer were certainly not in sync, and Vogt believed that the design would need to be substantially reworked for it to be viable. Vogt believed that the wings would need to be altered, the multiple cooler air intakes under wing and under fuselage needed to be altered, the landing gear needed to be altered, the tail needed to be altered. Basically, the bulk of the aircraft's design needed to be reworked in some fashion, according to Vogt. Now, did it actually need to be reworked, or was Vogt just being nitpicky? Judging solely by the fact that Messerschmitt was the more successful company around the time, with their fighters making up the bulk of Germany's fighter force, while Blohm Voss, to put it in the words of an old Zero Punctuation video, they were off chewing gummy bears in a space helmet, I would have to say that Messerschmitt probably had a leg up in what the design should look like. But with Messerschmitt also being much more occupied in other mainline vital to the war effort designs, they didn't really have much time to spare for this project, and likely largely because of that, when the two companies could not come to an agreement on the future of the design, the Reich Air Ministry ended up siding with Blohm Voss. So now, instead of collaborating, Blohm Voss had full control over the 155 design, and accordingly it would be renamed the BV-155. Now, under new management, the 155B1 underwent its redesign that gave it a very bizarre and unique appearance. The less noticeable alterations included the scrapping of the old wing that utilized the BF-109G's wings and the designing of a new, unique, not terribly different-looking wing. The horizontal and vertical tail surfaces were also slightly enlarged, and the landing gear was swapped out to be replaced with the gear of a Ju-87 Stuka. But the biggest change was to the cooling radiators. Doing wind tunnel testing with a variety of radiator designs, including Messerschmitt's 4 small radiators, Blohm Voss came to the conclusion that for the most optimal cooling, those 4 air intakes should be reduced to just 2, and they should be almost crudely just slapped on top of the wings around mid-wing, one on each wing. Also, in the BV-155's design plans would be an improved armament, of at least one 30mm cannon firing centrally, and at least 2 more guns in the wings, likely both 20mm. So with this new updated design, construction of the first 155B1 began in early 1944, and by September 1st, the first prototype would take to the air. While exact details on that first flight are pretty sparse, as far as I could find, the overall results were pretty disappointing. The main problem was that on taking off, and on maneuvers that increased the angle of attack, the plane overheated considerably. Even though the coolers were redesigned to preemptively solve this issue, it seemed like that initial wind tunnel testing didn't account for the plane's nose being up sometimes. When the plane was nose up, so on takeoff, when climbing, and when performing maneuvers, the coolers being on top of the wings proved to be a detriment, and the air just passed right over them. This then necessitated another redesign, at minimum another alteration to the coolers, moving them underwing. Doing this, though, altered the plane's center of gravity, which meant that the cockpit had to be moved as well, and while they were doing this, they altered the cockpit canopy to be a more high-vision bubble-style canopy. So this new model, the BV-155B1 V2, would take to the air on February 8, 1945, and while performance and cooling had indeed improved, Blohm Voss still wasn't happy with its performance. While the estimated top speed was to be upwards of 430 miles an hour, it's very unlikely that they ever reached that, as the V2 model suffered from some kind of damage or part failure on every one of its flights. Because of their overall dissatisfaction, and because they were technically working with the dregs of a design from a different company, Blohm Voss would propose a substantial redesign in what they called Project 205. The Air Ministry would accept this proposal, and so while the BV-155B1 V3 was being worked on, this one only really being different in that it had a stronger DB603 engine in it, Blohm Voss began more detailed design work on what was designated the BV-155C. Most notably, the C model would do away with the unique mid-wing radiators, and instead the engine would be fit with an annular radiator that allowed it to run as a de facto radial engine. This made the 155C look very similar to another high-altitude fighter in Focke-Wulf's TA-152. However, the 155C had a much greater wingspan than the 152, although its wingspan was now less than the 155B1, sitting at 18.65 meters. Other alterations included the wings being a different shape, particularly towards the root, the air intakes for the turbocharger including two cylindrical intakes on either side of the cockpit, and the landing gear being altered to be more narrow. There also appears to be another alternate 155C design that did away with the annular radiator and separate air intakes for the turbo, and instead concentrated all of the cooling into a large rectangular intake under the nose that gave the fuselage a rather triangular shape. Around 30 pre-production models of the 155C, likely the first model with the annular radiator, were ordered by the Air Ministry, likely sometime in early 1945. But before any construction could begin on any of them, and in the middle of constructing the 155B V3, Blohm Voss's factory would be taken over by Allied forces. So ultimately, I think the BV-155 or the ME-155, it definitely falls under the category of suffering from development hell or development purgatory, with its concept starting back before the war with the BF-109T, before that design then became outdated and switched over to the ME-155, before the 155's intended role dried up and it had to find a new one and then a new one again, and then the plane's ownership switched over to a new company who redesigned it again and again, and then the project just took so long that the war ended before they could do anything with this design. For roughly 7 or 8 years of work or so, the BV-155 amounted to almost nothing, other than some drawings, a few prototypes, and a weird-looking plane that had boxes on its wings. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. When I look at the BV-155 with its wing boxes, I kind of think of those, like, firefighting planes that scoop up water, but this one's like a miniature version for, like, I don't know, a rogue campfire in the middle of the woods. Or maybe that could have been the cooling method. You know, it's flying up at 50,000 feet, but you just dive down, scoop up some water, cool the engines down, and then climb back up. Clearly nothing wrong with that concept. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.